Well, after a couple days delay, because I was busy with a whole bunch of other shit, it is finally time to make my video of the Century Central, who has the Detroit Engines, the Oklahoma Oilers, the Minneapolis Kitsune, the Kansas City Hammerheads, and then the runner-up, the PFA Bowl 1, the Chicago 71ers. Let's get to work, starting with the Detroit Engines. Well, we get the video of the Century Central started with the worst team in the division, and that is the Detroit Engines. Man, what a change this team had from the beginning of the year. This team started off 2-0 and had that massive come-from-behind victory against Orlando to start the year. Then they got boat raced when they went to Philadelphia. But after that, they went on to win 2 more, including beating Baltimore to give them their first loss in M&T Bank Stadium. So now they're 4-1. They lost a close one to Baltimore, but then the next 2 weeks later, they beat El Paso, and now they're 5-2 and looking good in the division. Then, oh boy, they went on to lose all the rest of the games to finish 5-13. They had the third longest losing streak in PFA history behind Louisville's 0-13 start and Tampa's 0-14 start. So honestly, this is the worst losing streak of a team that's at least won a game. They went 11 in a row lost. What a disastrous finish that was to the year. On offense, they were 33rd in score, and they only scored 18 points. They were 30th in yards. They were 37th, so 4th to last in rushing yards. They got under 98 yards on the ground, but they were 19th in the air, getting over 231 yards a game passing. So they were in the top half the bottom top half in terms of passing. Then you get to defense. They were 34th in scoring, 37th in yards, so 4th to last. They were 16th against the run, though, so they did a solid job, I guess you could say, on the ground in terms of defense. But then they were third to worst in passing, allowing almost 270 yards a game. So this team is terrible, but not like that really like god awful well, except rush yards, yard defense, and pass defense. But man, this team is in a real hole. And one reason this team struggled was the quarterback position. Aaron Ventura, who started all 18 games, he threw for over almost 4,200 yards, but he only completed under 57%. He had 24 touchdowns, but he had 22 picks. So I think he was second in the league in picks. That's quite incredible, especially considering the fact that he threw a decent amount of touchdowns. But man, that's almost the same interceptions as touchdowns. So that really hurt that team. Their leading rusher, Joseph Brothers, had under 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns, but that also was due to the fact that he had I think it was a PCL injury that may have missed the final 4 games of the year. And right behind him, his backup, Hal Nolan, had over 500 yards and 5 touchdowns in 4 starts. So not a good team on the ground. But this team did have one incredible studded receiver, Joseph Chavez, who had over 105 receptions, almost 1,700 yards, but just 10 touchdowns. So that really did hurt, not getting that many touchdowns. And right behind him was Floyd Lindsay, who had 55 receptions, 700 yards, and just 3 touchdowns. The team had a solid offensive line with their guards and their tackles being the main problem. But they did have a one-man wrecking crew at linebacker, and that was Robert Bryson, who, just like Wilson Sharp, I believe his name was, for the Honolulu Phantoms, who had over 228 tackles, this guy had 190 tackles, and he had 2 sacks too, plus a pick. So he's definitely a very nice asset for them to have. But they didn't get that much tackles other than that. But they did have 2 sackers with over 10 sacks. And first was their linebacker, Kyle McCoon, who had 13. And right behind him is their defensive end, Timothy Gavin, who had 12. And then when you get to interceptions, this team got actually surprisingly a good amount of pressure for a 5-13 team. Looks like in total 15 picks, and the leading was like 23. So like around average for... And their leader was Ronald Wheeler, who had 4 picks. I mean, there's really no highlights other than that comeback from behind victory against Orlando in Week 1. That was pretty impressive. And then that victory against Baltimore at their place. That was pretty good. But overall, this team is a shit show. They lost their final 11 games. That's pretty bad. Matter of fact, they only won one game at home, and that was that first game hosting Orlando. They were going to lose all the remaining home games, and all the rest of their wins were on the road. So they can't even win in Ford Field, too. That's pretty bad. They're like a reverse of the Lions. So what can the Engines do? Well, with that 7th pick, they might be in a position still to get a quarterback, but they're really, really, really pushing it. So they might be forced to stick with Aaron Ventura for next season. And if they get a quarterback, it might be in the 2nd or 3rd round, because the talent for first round will probably be gone by then. They need to fix that running game. They need to get another receiver to complement Chavez. They can't just have a one-man wrecking crew on that receiving core. They got to get better linebackers probably too. Although they have 2 studs, so that's a good sign. And they need to get better on the defensive line too. But overall, this team is going to be in a shit show for a while, so I don't think they're going to get any much better next year. There are 2 teams that are pretty interesting in the Century Central that had terrible starts to the year, but turned it around. They have good finishes and are on the exact opposite side of the field. One is the Kansas City Hammerheads, which I'm going to get later, as they have a massive improvement on defense. And then this team, the Oklahoma Oilers, who have a massive turnaround on offense. But how did they finish the year? Well, they start off 0-4. And they went through 3 quarterbacks, and I think in those first 3 weeks. Their first starting quarterback, down with injury. Then his backup, down with injury. Then they brought in, I think it was a 40-year-old quarterback to fill in. And then Wiley Chesser, their normal starter, struggled and then went down to injury. And then they quickly went to Peter Rose, who is just as good and also had mobility too. And eventually, Wiley led them to 2 wins, but then they decided to go with Peter Rose for the rest of the season. Although he struggled a bit at first, he managed to get back into shape, and after falling to 2-6, they all of a sudden went on to win 4 straight and by wide margins. And matter of fact, they were putting up like 30-plus points in those games. One game, they almost got 40. However, they went on to go 3-3 the rest of the way to finish 9-9 and with the 20th overall pick. So this team was a bomb on offense. They were the 7th most highest scoring offense in the league. They were 3rd in yards, so that's impressive. They were the 2nd best running offense in the league. They averaged over 139 yards a game. They were 13th in the pass, which is surprisingly the worst. I'm sure a lot of that rushing yards came from Peter Rose. And on defense, oh boy, it's the exact opposite. They were 30th in scoring, allowing almost 24 points a game. They were 24th in yards allowed. That's not good. 24th in running yards allowed, and 20th against the pass. So they were like the bottom top half in passing. So this team had a very strong offense, but not a really good defense to finish the year. So now we get to the quarterbacks, and we'll start off with their 39-year-old starter, Richard Long. Seems like Chinese. He had 1 start. He completed just barely 59%, had 1 touchdown and 2 picks. And their first starter for the first part of the season was Wiley Chesser. He had 5 touchdowns, 4 picks, had a completion percentage of 65%, but only 1,000 yards. And he got injured twice, which helped Peter Rose, who was the starter for the rest of the season, to take over. And after struggling at the beginning of the season, he turned it around to get almost 3,000 yards. He has a completion percentage of over 62, 20 touchdowns, 14 picks, so he wasn't good at that. But he did have almost 500 yards on the ground and 5 touchdowns. So he is definitely a running quarterback and probably one of the best ones in the league. And then we get to the running backs with their leading runner, Ricky Roller, getting over 1,100 yards and 13 touchdowns. So he got a lot of touchdowns off of that. And right behind him was their other running back, Osvaldo Broadway, with over 600 yards and 3 touchdowns. And right behind him was Peter Rose with almost 500 yards and those 5 touchdowns. So this team was a bomb on the ground. I can't wait to see them next year if they get everything right. They had 2 100-yard receiving, 100 recepting receivers this year, with Paul Hillman getting 104, with almost 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns, and right behind him was Wilson Kahn with 111 receptions and over 1,300 yards and 4 touchdowns. And right behind him was another wide receiver, Patrick Addison, who had only 600 receptions but 7 touchdowns, so they had 3 solid receivers. A very good offensive line, although the times where they struggled to protect their quarterback was those games where Wiley Chester got knocked out, so I guess Peter Rose could thank that for helping him become the starter for the season. Leading tackler was their linebacker Michael Southard, who had 160 tackles, but he only had 1 sack, so that's kind of disappointing. And he had a 70 tackle lead against second place. This team did not get a lot of sacks. They got very few sacks, with James Baxter leading the team with 7 sacks, and he was a linebacker. And then when you get the picks, they got a good amount of picks, like around the same as Detroit did, with their lead interceptor Ray Durkin, their cornerback, getting 5. Highlights, that offense, that 4-game winning streak where they dominated San Francisco, they dominated Buffalo, they dominated Milwaukee, and they did a pretty good job against Minneapolis, which was really surprising. They had to pull a comeback against Manhattan, and they had to pull off a comeback against San Francisco. I think that went into overtime too, which knocked them out of the playoffs too. So they had a really impressive season. But those 4 losses to start the year and going then 2 in a row, including they lost to Detroit for one of those losses. To Detroit, you can't just lose to them, especially when they went on to lose 4 in a row. 11 in a row, and they did get some quality wins too. They beat Miami when they were struggling. They beat Birmingham. I think they may have given their last loss of the year. They beat Minneapolis. They swept San Francisco. That was very, very impressive. So this team had a lot of quality wins, but a very disappointing start to the year. And believe it or not, although that defense was terrible, their players did play. Their defensive players played really well. So much that defense could look like very strong next year. So be on the lookout for maybe Oklahoma all of a sudden come out of nowhere to win the Century Central. But I guess we'll wait and see. Then we get to another team that pretty disappointing finish to the year, and that was the Minneapolis Kitsune. This team started off 3-0, and they had, for a while, the number 1 defense in the league, and by a mile. The first games, they allowed just 6 free and 6 points. So that's 15 points in just 3 games. That's just incredible. But then after they lost a tough, hard-fought Monday night game at Chicago for the Century Central lead on the line, they entered a really weird trend where they would lose and then they would win. They would do that for almost the entire season. After starting off 3-0, they went for 9-6. But at the end of the year, the offense was starting to collapse. Their defense was not as good as it once was, and they would go on to lose the final 3 games of the year to finish 9-9. So a 3-0 start went 6-9 the rest of the way. So a disappointing finish to the season. So on that shitty offense, they were 34th in score, and that's definitely not good. They were 31st in yards, 26th on the ground, and 29th in the air. So they were not a good offense. But on defense, they were 11th in scoring. But I remember I said earlier at one point they were number 1 for a while. Then they fell to 11th. They are 14th in yards allowed. That's really good. They're 22nd on the ground. Not really good for a good defense. And 17th in the air. So they had a really strong defense, but unfortunately near the end of the year, it started to collapse. And that 9-9 finish showed it. They went through 2 quarterbacks this year. Their main starter, Samuel Clark, had a really good start to the year. However, at the end of the year, he had 2,000 yards, barely under a 59% completion, 10 touchdowns, just 4 picks. So he didn't get a lot of yards. Well, no wonder all those injuries. But he didn't get a lot of touchdowns either. That's kind of disappointing. But his backup, Philip Ainsworth, who also had a really solid start to the year. However, when he's had to start for like 6 weeks, I believe it was, he collapsed. Under 1,800 yards. He had just barely a 52% completions, and he had 7 touchdowns to 10 picks. So that team on offense, in terms of quarterback, just completely and utterly collapsed. Leading rusher was Gary Snyder with over 1,200 yards, but just 6 touchdowns. And right behind him was Colby Jones with over 650 yards and 4 touchdowns. So just like in terms of pass, they didn't get anything on the ground. They had 2 receivers though go over 1,300 yards, but they didn't get a lot of touchdowns. And first was Jonathan Kasky with 96 receptions and almost 1,400 yards. And right behind him was Alan Fernandez with 104 receptions and 1,300 yards. Both of them combined, though, just 9 touchdowns. So they got a lot of yards and receptions, but no scores off of it. And one thing that might have caused them to not have such a good offense this year was that offensive line, too. That offensive line was not really so good. They'd let up a lot of sacks this year. But as futilous as that offense was, on defense, oh boy, that was a whole different story. They had 2 linebackers that had over 100 tackles. And first was Francis Negrete with 143. And right behind him was his fellow linebacker, Eric Witt, with 122 tackles. They had a really, really good year. And on sacks, oh boy, not that many sacks, but their leader was Billy Gregory with 12 sacks. But then when you get to interceptions, this team was second in the league with picks. Second in the league, just shy of 1 of New Orleans. And their leading picker was Justin Gaines, their quarterback, who picked off 9 times. 9 picks, for crying out loud. And right behind him was Larry Humphreys, who had 5 picks, and he didn't even start a game this year. That is just incredible. And then you have their other quarterback, Clifford Dunham, who had 4 picks. And that is just incredible. Just between them alone, that's 18 picks, plus 2 more before more from the other teams. So the highlights, hey, starting 3-0 and having a pretty good season for pretty much the entire year until those last couple weeks is pretty good. I mean, they beat Chicago once, who was their arch rival, and made all the way to the PFA Bowl 1. That's pretty impressive. They beat Washington at their place once. That was pretty solid. They almost beat Pittsburgh at their place in overtime. They almost beat that was pretty solid. They almost beat Pittsburgh at their place in overtime. They almost beat San Diego in their place in overtime. They absolutely demolished Atlanta Trojans and gave them their first loss in the year. They had a pretty good season in terms of that. But then, of course, that terrible offense and the way they finished, I mean, oh my God, what a disastrous finish it was. That was a pretty embarrassing loss to Oklahoma in Week 10. They got destroyed both times when they played Dallas, including a 44-6 thrashing at home. Then they lost those 2 disappointing games at home, at hosting Pittsburgh and then hosting Kansas City for the final Sunday night game of the year that blew any chance of them going to the playoffs. That really stung. So what does this team need to do for next season? They are going to have to decide what they're going to do about the quarterback situation. Philip Ainsworth proved himself to be a backup, and Samuel Clark, he didn't look good at the end of the year, but he still maybe has a shot to remain the starter, but he has to stay healthy, and they got to get a better linebacking core. I said linebacker, I mean running backs. And overall, that defense is pretty strong, so I don't think they got to do anything about that. And they have way too high of a pick to maybe make a top pick for quarterbacks. They'll probably all be taken by then. Maybe they'll save a second or third round pick maybe for a quarterback to possibly replace Samuel Clark if he doesn't do good this year. But overall, oh boy, I'm not quite sure what to say about Minneapolis. I mean, that defense can get them to the PFA Bowl, but that offense, not so much. But if they want to have any shot, they got to get this team right. But we'll see next year if they're able to do that, because right now, it doesn't look very good for them. Then we get to one of the most disappointing teams in the league, even though they actually finished with a winning record, which is surprising because of how they started, and that's the Kansas City Hammerheads. This team had the number 1 overall pick, the first ever pick in PFA. They picked the best quarterback in the draft, Henry Settles, and they were like the only good team in this conference. Everyone else was so dog shit going into the season that it was widely thought that they were going to run away in a mile and win the Century Central. It was such a wide margin. It won a couple other close games that this team could have home field advantage by default and go all the way to PFA Bowl 1. However, this team started off 0-5 and at one point 1-6. But then they turned it around to get to 6-6. However, they would go 1-2 next couple weeks, including losing to Tampa at home to give them their first win of the year. How the fuck can you do that? But then they turned it around to win the final 3 games of the year to finish 10-8 and having one of the very good defenses to end the year. But overall, it still was a very disappointing year. Then we get to one of the most disappointing teams in the league, even though they actually finished with a win record, which is surprising because of how they started, and that's the Kansas City Hammerheads. This team had the number 1 overall pick, the first ever pick in PFA. They picked the best quarterback in the league in the draft, Henry Settles, and they were like the only good team in this conference. Everyone else was so dog shit going into the season that it was widely thought that they were going to run away in a mile and win the Century Central. It was such a wide margin. It won a couple other close games that this team could have home field advantage by default and go all the way to PFA Bowl 1. However, this team started off 0-5 and at one point 1-6. But then they turned it around to get to 6-6. However, they would go 1-2 next couple weeks, including losing to Tampa at home to give them their first win of the year. How the fuck can you do that? But then they turned it around to win the final 3 games of the year to finish 10-8 and having one of the very good defenses to end the year. But overall, it still was a very disappointing year. This team was 16th in scoring. They were 28th in terms of yards, 27th on the ground, and 25th in the air. So this team was overall not really good on offense, except getting points somewhat to some extent. But then on defense, oh boy, this turned it around big time after the first half of the season. 7th in scoring. This team had the number 1 defense in yards allowed. They allowed under 294 yards. That's really incredible. They had the 3rd best run defense in the league, allowing under 98 yards a game, and they have the 5th best pass defense, allowing under almost 195 yards. That's really incredible. So they have a really strong defense to finish the year that was even probably better than Chicago, who won the division. So we're going to get to them and see later. But this defense really turned it around at the end, just like Oklahoma's offense helped turn their season around at the end of the year. Alright, then we get to the most important part of this team, and that was the quarterback play. Their number 1 pick overall, Henry Settles, after having a very disappointing part of the year, first half of the year. He turned it around a lot the next year, but it wasn't really that enough. He got just barely 3,800 yards, had a completion percentage of almost 65%, 20 touchdowns to 15 picks. And that's so bad for being the number 1 overall pick and one of the best QBs in the league. His backup, Henry Peter, who played only a little bit of time, had a 60, almost 2/3 percentage completion percentage and threw a touchdown. He had almost a full game of stats, and he looked much better than the number 1 overall pick. That's really bad. On the ground, just like the passing, they weren't good. Michael Flowers, their leading rusher, had under 930 yards, but got 7 touchdowns, so he had a good season in terms of getting touchdowns. And Donna Oslin, right behind him, had 700 yards, but 8 touchdowns, so although they didn't get really a lot of yards, they did get a good amount of touchdowns. And Henry Settles actually had almost 300 yards on the ground, too, and he had 2 touchdowns, so that offense, that running game, not really good, but did get a good amount of touchdowns off of it. The struggles also showed up in the receiving corps too. Reginald Jones led the team with almost 100 receptions, under 1,200 yards, but just 4 touchdowns. Ugh. And right behind him, Jimmy Miles had under 1,000 yards and just 4 touchdowns. Ugh. Again, not a lot of yards, and most certainly not enough touchdowns. Their offensive line was pretty good, but a lot of the offensive line suffered major injuries too that probably also really hurt their pass and run protection. Surprisingly, for as good as this defense was, it did not get a lot of tacklers. Not really. There was no 100-yard tackler, only 190-yarder. That's pretty weird. But their defensive end, Otis Linder, led the league with tackles, but also led the team in sacks with 19. So really good. And Paul Wakerfield, their linebacker, had 13 sacks as well. So this team was pretty sack happy, but interceptions, no. Oh my God, just 11 picks. This team was terrible in terms of forcing turnovers. That defense and that strong finish at the end of the year was a pretty good highlight, but that offensive struggles, that 1-6 start after starting off 0-5 as well, plus the disappointing play of Henry Settles. Oh boy, this team was extreme disappointment for this year. And oh boy, the main thing that's going to be on this team in 2017 is going to be the play on Henry Settles. It's going to be year 2 now. He was a very disappointing start to his career. If he doesn't turn around, then this team's going to be in a very, very disastrous position, and it would look like they made one of the most big. They probably would have made the biggest PFA draft bust so far ever. But hopefully he can get set correct, because this team, remember, 5 of their 8 losses were within a touchdown. If they can get shit fixed, this team could be right, maybe in the mix with Chicago to win the Century Central. But we'll have to wait and see. Well, now we get to the final team of this video, and that is the PFA Bowl runner-up, the team that was runner-up for the championship, the Chicago 71ers. Oh boy, this team started off 9-0. They had the second best start in the league, right behind Omaha's 14-0. They were the last undefeated team in the Century Conference, but then they lost 2 straight away losses to Las Vegas and their arch rival Minneapolis in tough fashions. They turned it around to win 2. Then they got boat raced pretty good against Cleveland on Sunday night. However, they then went on to win 3 in a row to get the 14-3, and they had a chance to win, and they clinched home field advantage at home against Houston. However, they blew a chance to beat them and blew it in overtime to lose their first home game 2 of the year. But thankfully for them, Pittsburgh lost later that day to secure them the number 1 seed. So in the divisional round, they hosted the 5th seed Baltimore Charm, and Baltimore led 13-3 at one point, and Chicago managed to somehow, someway pull it out and make a comeback to win 20-13. So then in the conference championship, they hosted the Pittsburgh Blitz. And it was a hard-fought defensive struggle, which the Chicago won 21-16. But then their starting quarterback, Matthew Smart, went down for the rest of the year with injuries, with a really hard hit too. And of course, they lost their star linebacker for pretty much half the entire season due to a broken skull. So now their backup quarterback had to start for the PFA Bowl. And although he did a good job against Pittsburgh, he was no chance at all against the Omaha Thunder in the PFA Bowl. And Chicago would lose that title game 35-9. So it was a very disappointing year to a strong finish too. But let's look at the stats. They were the 5th best scoring team in the league. They were the 11th best in yards, 13th on the ground, and 15th in the air. So they got a lot of points and a lot of yards, but not really so much in terms of yards, on the ground and in the air. They were like average. But on defense, they were 8th in scoring. So that's one thing can't see being at. 9th in yards allowed, can't see being there too. 30th though in yards on the ground, so they did a very good job at not allowing yards at points, except on the ground where they were god awful. But 7th best pass defense. So overall, Kansas City did have a better defense than Chicago, which is quite incredible. But this team overall was still very strong for a 14-4 finish. Their quarterback, Matthew Smart, had almost 4,000 yards, over 63 completion percentage, 23 touchdowns, and 7 picks. But of course, him missing the rest of that missing PFA Bowl 1, that really, really, really hurt his team, because his defense did a really good job at stopping Omaha, so they might have been able to somehow pull it off. And on the running game, their leading running was Anthony Lonzo, had 1,200 yards for 7 touchdowns, and right behind him was James Hollenbeck, who had only 850 yards but 11 touchdowns. So this team got a lot of touchdowns on the ground. Leading receiver was David Tapia, who had 106 catches, so he had a really good year in terms of that. Over 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns, and right behind him was Raymond Hughes, who missed the rest of the season after the regular season due to flu, and got 900 yards and 5 touchdowns. So again, another injury that would really probably cost him in the playoffs. It had a solid offensive line. They didn't have a 100-yard tackler, but they had very consistent pressure in terms of tackling and sacks. Oh boy, this team was sack happy, including their defensive end, Alfred Helms, led the entire league with the most sacks with 25. That's more than the highest in the NFL with Strahan. I think it was like 22.5 or something like that. They got back in 2001. Alfred Helms would have broken that record easily. But on off defense, in terms of interceptions, they were not very good at all. But their quarterback, Jeremy Conley, got 8 picks though. So although they weren't good at getting turnovers, they had one player who was really good at it. So this is a pretty good season for them because they were not expected to do anything, and they start off 9-0. They finished 14-4 with home field advantage. They won 2 hard-fought games in the playoffs, and then made it all the way to PFA Bowl 1, where if it wasn't for injuries, they may have had a shot to beat Omaha, but the injuries came back to bite them in the ass, and they blew it big time. So that's a little disappointing. That's probably the only lowlight, is that terrible finish to the season, PFA Bowl 1, and all those injuries. It just bit them that hard when they needed them the most. So, unfortunately for Chicago, they need to get healthy. That's the main thing. But other than that, they need to fix the secondary. But even if they do all that, I think this team is going to suffer a PFA Bowl hangover. That wasn't just a loss to Omaha. That was a demoralizing loss. And we know what happens when teams suffer demoralizing losses. They struggle. Look at Cincinnati this year. They lost to the Steelers in the wild card round last year, and now they're 2-4. But of course, that could also be attributed to that strong schedule they had to start off with. Look at the Cardinals. After that humiliating loss they got to the Panthers in the NFC Championship, they started off 1-3. They rebounded to 3-3, but they're nowhere near as good as last year. And look at the Panthers. Fucking went 15-1 last year, and after they got destroyed by the Broncos in the Super Bowl, now they're 1-5, suffering the worst Super Bowl hangover I've ever seen. So we don't have a record yet of that happened in PFA Bowl yet after just one season. So we all know if there's such thing as a PFA Bowl hangover, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. And I got a feeling Chicago will get suffered with a deep Super Bowl hangover after that demoralizing loss. But I guess we'll find out sooner or later. Well, that's it for the Century Central. All that's left is the Century South, and then finally the Century West. I can't wait to get to them hopefully soon, so see you then.